Hello, everybody. We're back. Isn't that great? Woohoo! It seems like I haven't seen many of you for years, so it's great to welcome you back. There are a lot of programs scheduled for this winter. They are small programs deliberately, and many of them are sold out. So please look at the website often, sign up quickly, but there are some bigger programs that I do want to tell you about. Some of them have been up on the screen. On the 6th of March, the great Gilded Age Orchestra is returning to do some Gilded Age music, and I hope you'll all be there. 6 o'clock on the 6th of March. And the man who is he here? Mark Stickney is one of the, no, he's not here. Well, somebody keeps waving. So, no, Mark Stickney is not here. Yes, there he is in the back. Well, Mark, have many of you heard the Gilded Age Orchestra in the past? Well, they deserve an applause. Yay. And Mark has done yeoman's work in researching the music of this era and the music of Newport, and he really deserves a lot of credit. So we're behind you, Mark, on this. On the 11th of March, our chief conservator, Patty Miller, along with our textile conservator, Heather Hodge, will be doing a program for members only. So if you're not a member yet, this is an opportunity this should be an incentive for you to join. They're going to be talking about some of the research that they have done on the third floor of the breakers. And it's extensive, so you should try to attend that one if you can. Then on the 27th of March, which is a Thursday, Nikki Williams, Dr. Williams, and she is the woman you've heard from before who did the exhibition Wild Imagination, is going to be talking about some of the treasures in our collection, photography treasures that we have. Really fascinating collection, so I think you'll enjoy that. And then finally, on the 3rd of April, our Newport Symposium returns after not being here for almost 5 years, 3 years, okay. It's for one day, and it's called Piccolo Symposio, Little Symposium. And in November, we will try a bigger symposium, but we're very excited because we're going to be delving into the impact that Italian art had here in Newport. And some of the speakers include Nathaniel Silver, who is the Associate Director and Chief Curator at the Isabella Stewart Gardner, really good speaker. And Remy Renzullo, a very famous interior designer and antique advisor. And so I hope you will sign up for the Piccolo Symposio if you're interested. It's my great honor to introduce Leslie Jones, who is our Chief Curator and our Director of Museum Affairs. I think, are those all your friends in the front row? Who is backed up here by her friends. Leslie has been with us for about 5 years. She has her hands full with a variety of different projects, but I'm going to mention 3. She's right now helping us determine how best to move tens of thousands of objects from our houses into a climate-controlled collections facility that we have in Quonset in North Kingstown. And if you have never been part of a museum, you do not know, but should know, that this kind of project is huge. It's just a headache of all headaches. That's the best way to describe it. So I commend Leslie for taking that on. She is right now getting ready for the opening of an exhibition, which will open on the 30th of May, featuring Richard Morris Hunt. And we're so excited about that exhibition because we have things coming in from many institutions around the country and from the Library of Congress, and we've never had things loaned to us from the Library of Congress until this year, so she did a great job on that. And then she is helping young scholars, our fellows program. Some of our scholars are here in the room, be really good researchers and historians. And we're growing that program, our fellows program, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of careful thinking. So Leslie is a treasure here in the Preservation Society, and I am delighted I can't wait to hear what her choices are. I hope I agree with you. I hope we all agree with you. But thank you, Leslie.
Thank you, Trudy. I also want to say that you're all my friends tonight, so thank you for being here. I kind of forgot that there's suspense around this talk because it hasn't really been revealed what we're speaking to. And what I'm going to be talking about is the behind-the-scenes look and perspective of how we actually collect for the Preservation Society's collections. You know, we started as an institution that saved buildings, and in order for buildings to be worth visiting, they need to be populated with material. So we have evolved into a very serious museum structure. We are now accredited by the American Alliance of Museums. We hold that very dear because it puts us in a position with other museums across the globe, and it gives us a level of respect you can't achieve otherwise. So I'm going to be sort of walking through some of the process behind how we collect, so you understand the methodology, and then also giving you some examples of, well, from my perspective, what I think are the most interesting aspects of our collecting history. I want to start off by just noting that in 2024 alone, we had 106 original objects returned to our properties. You might think that that seems a little odd because most of these houses are fully furnished, but you have to remember that some of the properties we have as a part of our collection came to us completely unfurnished. And I'll be talking about that a little bit further. I also want to sort of, I guess, take the cloak back about some of the perceptions that people might have about museums, particularly when you have beautiful Gilded Age mansions. We don't have unlimited funds. We don't have unlimited staff. We don't have unlimited resources to care for these pieces. So we have to make very specific decisions about what we take on to our care, because the reality is that once we accept something into our collection, our hope is that we take care of it forever. Far behind when I'm in the grave, some of these things will still be here. So I'm just going to take you through some of these efforts. So for the sake of this lecture, I'm going with my favorite alliteration about sort of how we look at our collecting strategies. So we go through a process of discovery, and then we go through a process of discussion, and then we have to make decisions. So it's simplified, but for the sake of 45 minutes, I don't want anybody to fall asleep. I'm going to keep it very, very simple. So with discovering, which is first, we have objects come to us in a variety of ways. And that can be through the relationships we keep with auction houses, with antiques dealers, with members of families associated with the Preservation Society properties. I know many of us have Google alerts that ping when something like Richard Morris Hunt comes up on the internet. I also periodically get emails at 2 a.m. from our registrar when she's searching through eBay and can't sleep. So these things come from all different parts of the spectrum. There's no single recipe about how things enter into our collection. If you think about it, there are probably things from your grandparents or great-grandparents that exist in your attic that you're not thinking a museum may want, but you might be wrong. So just keep that in mind too for your own sort of personal understanding and relationship to what we'll talk about tonight. We have also inherited a really incredible collection of knowledge from previous curators and museum employees that have made notes on information they've found too within the community here in Newport, and then broader than that allow us to sort of trace back where things might exist. We're always trying to bring things original back to the houses. And in some cases, we don't have the opportunity to do that, but again, I'll get into that a little bit further. We maintain files and periodically check them to see what the status of any of the objects are that we know are located in permanent collections in other museums or in other private collections. And we have a substantial amount of companies, advisors, and private individuals who contact us directly. So one of the, I guess, interesting parts of my job is the cold calling that comes in. That's sort of the king of museum collecting for a place like the Preservation Society. Emails, phone calls, letters, random packages with attention to me that arrive at our doorstep. They all can have very interesting or even not interesting connections to our collections here, but we don't overlook any of them because something that might seem unobvious could later reveal a very specific relationship to the Preservation Society and what we're trying to do with our collections here. So once we've discovered an object, we then get to work on building a case through research. So we look at research from a wide variety of angles, but one of the first places we go to are reliable resources. And what we have listed here are what sort of in the field we call primary resources. And those are journals, diaries, memoirs, inventories. I mean, there's a whole host of things that we try and find and identify and corroborate evidence with. We're, of course, also looking at the object itself. So if somebody sends us a picture of a plate that they think might be interesting to us, we ask, can you send another picture of the back of it? We're trying to sort of create a whole picture here and then look for key clues that tie the physical evidence to the object itself. And with visual representations, okay, I'm gonna make sure I spelled that correctly. That includes photography, drawings, paintings, and also portraiture. So we take inventory of all the available information, we sort through it and distill that knowledge into a format that can then sort of justify if something should or should not enter into our collection. And then, again, as I had mentioned before, and I want to dig into this a little bit more. So Trudy mentioned that we're about to move approximately, thousands of objects off-site as they're being stored in our properties currently. But we have about 100,000 objects in our collections, and that includes our permanent collection and our archival collection. What I had mentioned before with some of our houses that we have in our collection, such as Kingscote, Chepstow, Green Animals, and Rosecliff, those are 4 sites that were gifted to the preservation full of their collections. Soup to nuts. In some cases, we have found pieces of clothing, we have found letters, we've found photo albums, we've found Christmas cards. Everything is still in that house, and so that feels like it's a pretty complete picture. On the other hand, we have 5 sites that have been purchased that are in our collection that didn't have any material in them whatsoever. So that would be Hunter House, Isaac Bell House, Chateau-sur-Mer, the Elms, and then the Osgood Pell House, which is our headquarters on Bellevue Avenue. And then we have 3 sites that were purchased with partial collections donated. So that includes Marble House, the Breakers, and the Breakers Stable. And we have materials in those houses that are constantly re-entering into our collection. But even with the collecting of materials, whether they be gifts or purchases, the work is endless, and there exists such a narrow view of the past too that we have to be broad in our thinking. So if you think about Kingscote in one instance, so Kingscote was donated to us with all of its contents, but that also just reflects one family that lived there, even though there are multiple families that live there. The Jones family, for example, built the house. Now, we didn't know much about the contents that were in there, but we have, as I'll mention in a few short minutes, we've now reestablished connections with the descendants of that family, and we are talking through how we can re-enter some of those objects into our collection. So after we've sort of gone through the discovery process, we now enter into the discussion process. And that involves a series of individuals. The discovery process is mostly our curators and our collections and our conservation team sort of vetting objects and making sure it's something we want to take to the next level. And then discussion really begins after we've created all of this content and evidence to speak with our executive director, with Trudy, and talk about why we have a case for something to enter into our collection. That is then followed with Trudy's approval. It goes on to our collections committee. And our collections committee is made up of a group of volunteers who are experts, enthusiasts, and individuals who can help advise us on those next steps. And they ask poignant questions that we may not think of. So we have this discussion and then decide and determine whether something should enter our collection. And if it is then approved, it goes into the decision-making process, which is a vote. So we vote to enter something into the collection. It then becomes a part of the permanent collection or archival collection, however we characterize that. And in some cases, we do also take things to our board of trustees. And that usually revolves around whether an object is of a certain value and if we have the funds to spend on that particular associated value. I do want to make it very clear, though, I don't always get permission. So it is a process that is designed for checks and balances. So we can make recommendations, and for example, at certain given time, we may not have the funds to actually acquire something at a certain level. So we'll table it, we'll put it away, we'll again go back to those files and revisit those objects as we move through time, just to make sure we pin where some relevant materials may still exist. A lot of what we do is also guided through what we call our collections management policy, and that is a board-approved document that the collections committee and as the staff we have to follow and abide by. And it does really help us because it puts a scope in place of what we should and shouldn't be collecting. And we've divided that up into 3 tiers, essentially. So I'm going to start with tier 1. And a tier 1, I'm going to quote this, are objects, architectural elements, documents, or finishes original to a property or family that are critical to interpretation or considered character-defining features. So what we see here is the Elms dining room, which is a recent image. And when the Elms, after Edward Berwind died, he left the house and all of its contents to his sister Julia, who continued to live in the space until 1961. And at her death, as many of you probably know, there was a very grand auction that took place in the house itself. And many pieces were removed and sold at that auction, including all of the over-door paintings in this particular room. So literally above the door, there are 17th and 18th century Venetian paintings by grandmasters that were removed and sold at auction. So those paintings went to various owners because they were sold in different lots. And over time, we were able to keep track of them, to know where they were. And Armin Allen, who was one of our former curators and chairman of the board, was very fastidious in keeping track of these. And in 2004, we had the opportunity to buy and reacquire some of these paintings. 6 of them, actually. We were able to acquire 4 of the 6 that had been sold. So those 4 came back into our collection. We knew where the other 2 were. They were with a gallery, and their prices were horrendous. So again, kept on them, and finally a deal was struck in 2012. And those last 2 paintings, including this painting right here by Sebastiano Ricci, finally came back to the Elms. Something also to sort of think about in context with this room too, the larger, more historic paintings, those were scheduled to actually be torn down with the house before we saved it. So some pieces were removed because they could be, some pieces weren't. And one last other object story in here, the table that you see here is the original dining room table created by Jules Allard, who was the interior designer of the Elms. And it actually was found in the boardroom at Brown University. So an exchange was made where if we could replicate that table and provide that to the university, they would gift this table back to us. So the original table is now in its place. Another example of Tier 1 materials includes this incredible portrait of Alice Vanderbilt by Madrazo. This is really one of the most prized objects in our collection. Now, I mentioned that we try to focus on things that are original to the houses, but this painting actually is not original to the Breakers. It's original to the family's home on 57th Street in New York, which is the image on the right. So that's around 1920. And they make the decision sometime after 1920 to move it to the Breakers. So it was a gift to us from the estate of Countess Antony Sapari, and the Countess was the granddaughter of Alice Vanderbilt. And even though it was not original to the Breakers in 1895 as designed by the designer and the family, the fact that the decision was to move it to this house held great significance. It's also by an incredibly renowned artist, and it's one of the most poignant ways of us to exemplify the people that lived in the house. It's a person who's here, not just a chair to look at or a beautiful vase, but it is a person. And so this was one of those very easy decisions to make. Now we're going to talk about Tier 2. So Tier 1, objects original or important to the families. And Tier 2 are objects that are not original, but serve as an appropriate period representation of historic furnishings or finishes and possess a meaningful relationship with an individual. So we're back at the elms again. On the left, you'll see an image from around 1920-25 of the interior of the breakfast room. And there are these beautiful caned chairs by, again, the Allard studio in Paris that were created for the elms. Those, again, were sold in the 1962 auction. We have no trace of where they went. Still to this day, not a clue. But it became available to us sometime in the early 21st century to acquire these chairs on the right, which were from a house down the street, Chetwode, which burned, as many of you probably know. But Chetwode was a house designed by the same architect as the elms, even though it had a different interior designer, like Rose Wagafi, who created this chair. It's a similar composition, similar style, and it also helps us tell that story of not only form and design decisions from the period, but also preservation. Chetwode couldn't be saved, but the elms could be. So including those objects in representation of similar styles is helpful, but then also helps us embody the idea of what we are as an institution, which is saving buildings. Now I'm not gonna bother you with tier 3 actually, because tier 3 is things that are not original, as you can probably guess. And so we try not to focus a lot of our energy and funds on acquiring those objects, but they sometimes are necessary when we just can't find something that is fitting into tier 1 or tier 2, and there's an obvious gap in our collection. But I'm gonna move now towards some of our recent stories. So this is original furniture from Kingscote. And as I'd mentioned, George Noble Jones built Kingscote around 1841. It wasn't actually called Kingscote then, it was called the Jones Villa. And we have Jones represented in an image on the top left, and we have Kingscote as it was designed by the architect around the period of its being completed. We really had no clue what happened to the material in this house. Jones and his family had to flee Newport at the beginning of the Civil War. They weren't welcomed here. They were Southern plantation owners. And so what we've learned from the family is that pretty much they packed up everything, all the contents of the house, and moved it to a purpose-built warehouse in Savannah. And it stayed there for about 70 years. So the family knew about the warehouse. Things were boarded up. They were checked in. Obviously, they paid the electrical bills, so they knew it was there. And then slowly over time, they've reclaimed this furniture. And so on the top right is a settee original to Kingscote or the Jones Villa, which has just been donated back to our collection by the family. And the bottom right is a cradle from the family that is also claimed to be from this same house that the family just alerted us to in January that they'd like to gift to us. So as you probably, I hope all of you have visited Kingscote, but it's stuffed with stuff. So our new challenge is, where is it gonna go? And that's also part of our discussion and discovery phases of collecting at the Preservation Society, but these were too good to pass up. So we will find a place. And it's important for us to be able to tell the story of Jones because we focus a lot on the architecture and the importance of this house in particular, but we don't have any physical ways of telling his history and legacy across, the good and the bad of the era in which it took place. I'm also hoping that the portrait that they have of him, which is on the left, that they own, will also come to us eventually. So just a plug if the family's watching. This was a very recent acquisition. This was at auction in Providence, actually, by descent of a Wetmore family member. It's a portrait of William Shepherd Wetmore, who was the individual who financed the building of Chateau-sur-Mer, which is on the bottom right. This is its original iteration by Seth Bradford, the local Newport architect, before Richard Morris Hunt came in and did several iterations to change its facade and interiors. But this is the earliest known likeness of William Shepherd Wetmore. He was the scion of the family. He's the one who created multi-generational wealth through his participation in the China trade. And it's also by a rather well-recognized Philadelphia portrait artist, Francis Martin Drexel. It's also signed, and it's also inscribed on the back the date that it was painted and the person who's in the painting. So we have all the evidence we needed We also don't have much evidence about how to tell the Wetmore family story, particularly this generation at Chateau-sur-Mer. So acquiring this piece will help us talk about the origins of the house itself. It obviously was in the house, because as we'll learn from the next slide too, the last surviving member of the Wetmore family, Edith Wetmore, who owned the house, when she passed away in 1966, the contents of this house, like the Elms, were also all put up for auction. So family members could come pick out the pieces they liked. Obviously somebody liked this, so they picked it out. But the rest of the contents were all sold to perfect strangers and not recorded in a way that we were able to track them down. So when things like this become available to us, it's important that we seize the moment. So this was a great acquisition. It needs a little bit of conservation work. I know it's in the conservation studio, so once we're able to get it in the condition it needs to be, this will be exhibited at Chateau-sur-Mer. Keeping on that theme, there is approximately 70 pieces of Chinese export porcelain that were documented as a part of the auction in 1969 that I'd mentioned at Chateau-sur-Mer. They were all brought back from Canton by Wetmore during his enterprise of trade between China, Chile, and America. So these pieces were original to the individual we just saw, and they obviously weren't as worthwhile to the family members when the house contents were made available, because these were all sold at auction to Doris Duke. And so these have been down the road at Rough Point since 1969. And this is where camaraderie amongst museum staff at other institutions is really important for us. We were relatively aware of what was there, not the entire holdings of the collection. But after conversations of what all might be at Rough Point, the curator there, as well as their staff, made the recommendation to their collections committee that they should transfer it to us. And so all of these ceramic wares have been officially transferred to us free of charge and have been reinstalled in their original place in Chateau-sur-Mer's pantry. So finally returned after, almost 60 years. So we don't always spend money. This is, when we get something for free, we really try and get something. Back to the Elms. This is the second floor landing of the Elms around 1920, the interiors. This was also the image that we started with. These photographs are incredibly important to us, again, going back to sort of the documentation that we need to make decisions. This was actually a photograph that was previously unknown to me, and it was sourced and delivered actually by our curator emeritus, Paul Miller, to help show the placement of this sculpture, this tiny little sculpture that was at the Elms, acquired by Edward Berwind for his house. And this was also, again, part of that 1962 auction that I had mentioned before. So it had left, and it went down the street to Clarendon Court. And it had been there until October of 2024. And thanks to Google and Christie's, we were able to make sure that this was, in fact, the original piece, also by comparison of the image. And we were able to reacquire this with funds provided by the Preservation Society in October. And it, too, is in a lovely little crate in the conservation studio being assessed. And we'll go back to the Elms, but not here. Well, at least not at that specific corner on a very narrow column where somebody's just dying to knock it over. I also want to give some acknowledgement to Nikki Williams, who did a deep dive on the history of this piece, too. And probably we now know for the first time how Berwind acquired it, because she found it listed in the artist, the sculptor's estate after he passed away in the 1890s. So now we have even more information about this particular sculpture. I should mention, too, that there is another Pio Feti sculpture already on the property at the Elms, but it's a life-size statue piece that's in the back, on the back terrace. And I'm going to end with this, and this is because this is my favorite piece of all time, largely because it did go to prove the idea that no call should ever go unanswered. And this bed and dressing commode was made known to us by an individual who called some extension at the Preservation Society, and I actually think Beverly Ware may have transferred the call to me. It was an Aspen, Colorado area code, and a gentleman said, I think I have furniture original to the Elms. I had mentioned this to somebody years ago when I visited, and I never followed up. I was like, oh, okay, great, we've heard this before. So he sends me these images of this beautiful 19th century furniture in his very 20th century Colorado house. And I'm not originally convinced, but we decide as a team, the collections, conservation, and curatorial team, to dig a little bit deeper. And one of the first things we go to, as I mentioned again, that auction catalogs are so important. We were able to find what's highlighted here, the entry for the sale of a bedroom suite at the Elms. Now, we also had to probably deduce that this was from Mr. Berwin's bedroom because it does not echo any of the design choices of other bedrooms. So I'm going to read it for you in case you can't see it from where you are. It's contents of bedroom excluding the preceding. Carved walnut double bed with rose crimson silk damask canopy, marble top dressing commode with mirror, library table, 3 side chairs in crimson damask, marble top night table, carved with bow-knotted wreaths and linen fold devices in the French 16th century style. Now, the bow-knotted wreaths and the linen fold are what sold this for us. So we spoke with the individual, and he very graciously donated this back to the Preservation Society. We had to pay for shipping. So it arrived, it came to the Elms, and it was taken apart piece by piece by Carola Schuler, our furniture conservator. And she and our curators and further conservators too really examined the entire network that existed within these pieces. So we found with graphite on drawers the letter D, which would stand for droit, which means it was made in France because it's the right door rather than putting an R in English. And same with the D and the G, droit et gauche. So we have directions for the person who's assembling this piece of furniture, which is a great indicator. And I think one of the big selling points was also looking at what already existed in the Elms. And that is, on the right-hand side here, the mirror that exists in Mr. Berwin's bathroom. So if you can look closely and see the ways in which these two mirrors are composed, they are really echoes of each other in terms of a design style, which also leads us to believe that they were both produced by the Allard studio. So putting all these pieces together, we were just so excited to bring this back to the Elms. And so this is where I'm gonna end our conversation and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think that was a treat for all of us. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand and I will run over with the microphone.
Captain Brown over here.
Who sits on your collection committee?
Oh, many people do.
An issue?
Our chairs of the collections committee are Rusty Powell, who is the former head of the National Gallery of Art, and Stephen Lash, who's the chairman emeritus of Christie's. And then we have appraisers, former curators, former dealers, and also members of the Newport community that know these houses through and through to help us make those decisions.
There's no link between the Board of Trustees and between the Board of Trustees and the curatorial effort?
Yes, the Board of Trustees is connected. We, by our bylaws, must have a member of the Board of Trustees as a chairperson of the committee, and Rusty Powell is both on the board as well as the co-chair of the committee.
Now, I asked the question because it's famous that a camel is a horse designed by committee.
Yes. We love our committees. Yes.
Do you have a specific time frame or defined period for the houses in terms of what you'll accept, given some of them have a longer history of people who lived in them?
That's a very good question, and I think up until recent history, we have tried to remain narrow. Kingscote's a perfect example. When that was donated to us, again, it was chock full. There's no room for anything. But when we started to see more material surface about related family members, depending on generations. And again, going back to the Jones family, we're now broadening that reach. And likewise with Rosecliff, Rosecliff was donated by the Monroe family, filled with Monroe family furnishings. They were the last owners of the house. And while that was an incredible act of generosity, and they still help and support us today, we are more focused on the era of the Ulrichs family who built the house during the Gilded Age. So, for example, in the ballroom, we recently reacquired original custom-designed planters that were from the Ulrichs period by Jules Lallard, who did the interiors. So we never really stopped looking, too. And, likewise, if you think about the breakers, we acquire as much as we can original to the family's, opening of the house in 1895. But if you go into Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's bedroom, or Gertrude Vanderbilt's bedroom as a young girl, we also emphasize her career as an artist and what sort of drives her legacy too, which is outside of that time period because she didn't live there when she was, this very significant artist and philanthropist. So it's situational. We'll hear any argument. Trudy will hear any argument, but ultimately, we have to convince the committees that it's worthwhile on taking on.
Tell them about the acquisition of
The bronzes.
outside of the bronzes,
Yeah, so full credit goes to Nikki for that one. Several of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's materials and personal belongings have been popping up at auction recently. And so we got wind of one in Florida, and Nikki scoured the auction website and found several bronze panels that were studies by Gertrude for a World War I arch, a commemoration arch that was temporarily in Washington Square Park in New York City. The studies for those were for sale, and Nikki identified two that were really significant that not only showcased her artistic side, but also her deep connection to the war. Her oldest brother, surviving brother, Neely, served in the war, and it was probably one of the most consequential moments of her lifetime, too. So also she depicts a very diverse background of soldiers that are serving during that period in one plaque. So for us to be able to show that complexity of her approach to art and art form, as well as the period in which she lived, was a really important objective, but it doesn't fit exactly into the breakers. So, yes.
Thank you. I loathe a microphone. I guess my question is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. You mentioned that when Rosecliff was acquired, it came with the most recent owner's belongings. Mm-hmm. Do you keep all of those things, or do you ever sell something from the collection that you don't
we do both.
want or need?
Yeah, we do both. It's very healthy for a museum to go through a process of what's called deaccessioning. Because we have many generations of curatorial leadership and also situational understandings about objects during certain periods of time, we have probably accumulated more than we actually need as an institution in some cases. So with Monroe furniture, for example, because so many of these spaces are not furnished, currently a lot of them are out on loan, actually. So if you visit Edith Wharton's The Mount, most of the Monroe family furniture from Rosecliff is at the Mount right now. They needed spaces to fill, and so we provided as a friendly loan for them. And if, going back to the point I was making before about places like the Elms that were acquired by the Preservation Society devoid of furnishings, we've also acquired pieces to just fill those rooms to get it open for the public. So we have over-acquired. In fact, Mr. Berwin's bedroom suite is a great example. That room was totally furnished with beautiful 18th century English furniture, but it wasn't Berwin's furniture. And now that his furniture is coming back, we're making the proactive decision to release those materials from our collections through the deaccession process, which is as complicated actually more complicated than the accessioning process, because we research those materials down to the bone, not only the objects themselves, but also from whom they came, making sure we can identify, the individual or next of kin to make them aware of the decision we're making. We then again have to bring it to the collections committee. They have to approve it, and then the board also has to approve it by mandate. So it's none of coming in or going out, none of it's taken lightly, and it's, why I probably should start getting Botox, because I have so many lines on my forehead. It's a lot of work. That's project number 4, Trudy, that I'm working on. That's very big. Is the deaccession. So yeah, it's complex and it's layered, and it's like having a big family. You have to treat each object like it's its own individual child, and all of them are our favorites. That's a good question, though. Back there, Gary.
Leslie, you mentioned that Isaac Bell House was one of the houses acquired by the Preservation Society void of furnishings, and it's still largely that way. Can you discuss that a little bit? Are we interested in acquiring anything that was at Isaac Bell House, or are we going to keep it relatively empty to emphasize the interior architecture and design as we do now? Thank you.
I think my word of the night is complex. So Isaac Bell House, again, being acquired as a significant form of architecture, designed by McKim White, didn't have furnishings in it. And at the same time, the Bell family didn't keep the materials we need to know what furniture was in it. We've also looked through the McKim White papers at Columbia and New York Historical Society, and there's no indication of how they may have worked with the Bells to furnish the space too. So we're not actually sure what was there. There was an attempt when we first acquired the property and did a series of conservation and preservation efforts to furnish it, and it just wasn't quite matching up from what the records and my predecessors have told me. And when you break it down, Isaac Bell House is one of the few opportunities we have to really focus on architecture, because it is a genesis of what the American style of architecture is. It's influential to Frank Lloyd Wright, to the open floor plan. So it possesses so much more as an object itself rather than the furnishings that are in it. And we have to look at all these houses individually. So it's one of the reasons why I think it's so great the way that we create the visitor experience. Although there are several big white Gilded Age mansions, each of them has different stories to tell, different furnishings and interior design details that make them stand out. And we treat them that way as well.
I'm just wondering if there's any one particular item, or maybe even a short list of items, that we're particularly on the lookout for, that sort of elusive item that you really, really want to get back into the collection.
If anybody can find the night table and the 2 side chairs to this suite, I would really love that. This suite was bought, so the bed and the dressing commode were bought with all of the other things that were listed in this entry in the catalog that I mentioned by the same person. They were all in a room together in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And at this person's death, his estate split up all the furniture to friends of his, to the owners. And for some reason, the estate didn't give this individual all of that furniture. So I would love to know where the side table and the chairs are for this. It's a good question. I'm trying to think. Of course, Julie from development has to ask that question here. Are you trying to fundraise?
What about records relating to the construction of the breakers?
Yes, any original documents, I think, are definitely a priority. I'm going to say sorry to our archivist, Jenna, here, because I'm going to make more work for her. We did not start as, again, I mentioned we started as saving houses, and we had to populate those houses with furnishings to make them open to the public. We didn't keep documents or primary resources that we found in these places. In fact, responsibly, we gave them to the Rhode Island Historical Society or the Providence Historical Society. So the Wetmore papers that were found in the attic of Chateau-sur-Mer, we didn't keep. We gave them to institutions in Providence. But we are actively now, as an accredited institution and a serious hub for research and scholarship, trying to build out our archives with original material that supports this knowledge we're hoping to grow. There are drawings at the Library of Congress by Richard Morris Hunt of places like the Breakers, but they're not as built. They're versions of it. Marble House is probably the house, I would say, where original architectural plans would be the most significant, because there has been so much changed over the years with the addition of an elevator, with walls being moved, with the expansion of what may have been a dressing room into now a trophy room to honor Harold Vanderbilt's legacy. So we also still don't know where the sons of the Vanderbilts slept. So they could be in the attic, they could be in the rooms that we interpret currently. So trying to find that hard evidence that gives us decisive information is really valuable. That's a good point.
Looking at where they may be stored, have you had a good relationship with some of the other museums like Metropolitan Museum, who has a big storage area, and sometimes they can't remember if they have them,
Yeah.
or they've cataloged it,
Yeah.
and other places?
Yes. So one of our most recent adventures has been in search and pursuit of works pertaining to Ogden Codman, who was a designer for the second and third floor of the Breakers and also of Chateau-sur-Mer, of the Green Salon. Codman papers are at Historic New England. Codman papers are also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But the interesting thing about the Met is they don't actually category the Codman papers as research material or as objects in their collection. They're in research files. So if you want to try and find something online through their collections catalog, it doesn't show up. So we maintain relationships with curators across the world to essentially make sure that they have their antennae up thinking about us. And that goes for objects that are original to our houses, but also ideas that overlap with ours. We're in great conversations with the National Trust in the UK right now about American women and their influence in the 20th century in the UK and vice versa. So collaboration and camaraderie is incredibly important in the work that we do, regardless if it's collections or just research in general.
I do have one more, excuse me for that. You've been very eloquent saying why certain objects have come back and with their story. Could you talk about the interpretation of those objects once they're in place? Mm-hmm. Because a museum with just things without telling people what the things are is not really doing its job.
Yeah, absolutely. We are an education-based mission, so interpreting objects through tours is incredibly important. We're venturing more into that now than I think we have in the past. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming to be in a furnished room that's covered head to toe and pick out the things that make a story, a continuous story throughout an entire experience of a house. But we try and use objects almost like documents. What can that object tell you about history? How can the arrangement in this bedroom with a bed here and a desk here, what does that tell you about a person and what they did day to day during the time period? So we try and use them less about connoisseurship and more about how material culture informs your understanding of the past. And that is, again, is something that we are experimenting with constantly. Scholarship is always changing. We did 2 recent tours, new tours, audio tours that were written for Chateau-sur-Mer and Kingscote that were just launched in the past 2 years. And that was kind of the trajectory we were working on. We are also going to be creating more tours that are specifically just object focused. So you're not talking about social or cultural history, you're talking more about fine and decorative arts history. So that's why I have a job. I have more things to do.
So if you looked at everything you could repatriate, what's the percent do you think of what's out there versus what you have? It's hard to know, but
it's hard to know. Yeah. Because I'd have to sort of think house by house in that sense. That stumps me.
The Breakers, like 96% of it is original, and then there's a remaining 4% that we'd love to have.
Sure. So each house we do in an annual sort of state of collections report review the percentage of original collections at each house. The Breakers probably has the most, followed by Marble House. The Elms to me is really the house that stands out the most. We're learning so much about Edward Berwin's collecting tendencies. I'll put it politely in that way. He was a master collector, and unfortunately, the real masterpieces in his collection are now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. After he passed away, his sister, who inherited the house and who eventually passed away there, She gave his masterpieces to really significant institutions, so I know I'm never going to get those back. But I think to be commended, maybe the most significant repatriation that we've had are those Venetian paintings from the Elms. They set the stage for the room. The room was designed around them, and they really mark a time in history of Gilded Age interior design coming to a close. So that's, like I would say, as a reflection, even though I had nothing to do with it, I'd say that may be our biggest achievement thus far as an institution.
How useful is the press in identifying certain objects? For example, like Leslie's Illustrated Weekly, and might be at Marble House downstairs near the exit. There's a photograph of the costume party with the safari costumes.
Mm-hmm.
So from the press, are you able to identify clothing, furniture, and perhaps scenes that may help you in your research of putting together this fine mystery?
From a visual representation in journalism, we don't really see anything that's helpful probably until like the 1950s or 60s when we see the interiors of these houses being photographed for the press. But written descriptions are very helpful. There are wonderful descriptions about the Fête Chambre that was hosted at Chateau-sur-Mer by George Peabody Wetmore that describes the florals and the interior decor. So we sort of have one person's perspective on what they saw and what they found to be the most interesting. Likewise, at Kingscote, there are great details about family weddings and, again, how things were arranged, when the doors were flung open, how the food was presented, and on what types of serving devices. So we try and piece together all of those little things if they're available. I think that the most valuable subscription service we have right now is newspapers.com, because there has been a huge movement, particularly with the death of local journalism, of historical institutions digitizing historical newspapers. And when they're digitized, you can then search, for keywords, and we can find all sorts of great information through that. In some cases, we also have to take point of view into account and tone in the way a journalist is writing about a certain event or interior. Sometimes they're a little snarky. So we'll digest it, keep it, and see if we can meet somewhere in the middle.
Thank you. And a follow-up, please. Any thoughts about bringing back the luncheon for pets on silver plates, a la Harry Lair, or Mamie's famous chimpanzee in a tuxedo?
Yeah, I know my dog would love that. No. That's the simplest answer I can give tonight. That's a hard no. We have a question over here. Oh, if you can wait for the microphone. Just for our friends on Zoom, we want to make sure that they hear us through the microphone.
What about the fixtures in the houses, the chandeliers and the sconces and things like that? Were they, even the railings, were they taken out of the Elms and some of the other houses that were dismantled? The interiors were dismantled?
For fixtures, light fixtures, we have not seen much taken out of the Elms, but we have seen a lot of the globes, the beautifully pressed glass globes that look like tulips floating over those. Those were taken out, and so those have been recreated. Isaac Bell House, actually, no, let me take a step back. Going back to Chateau-sur-Mer, as that house was owned by 4 generations of the family, they made changes inside. So in some cases, in the final generation with Edith and Maud Wetmore, they stripped the historic wallpaper off of the walls, but they saved samples and sent it to Cooper Hewitt. So we can at least go to those resources at the Smithsonian to find what those wallpapers were. Likewise, beautiful stenciled ceilings that were added as interior decor during the Hunt additions to the house, those were whitewashed. And our expert conservators have been able to basically find the repeat and recreate those in a very, very methodical and scientific way. I'm trying to think. We certainly had, I think, probably our biggest challenge with Isaac Bell House. Multiple generations of ownership, various uses of the house. At one point, it was a retirement home. It was a law office. There were partitions put up in the dining room to make them into 2 bedrooms while it was, a home for convalescents. So, we certainly have to peel back layers on a lot of occasions to try and find those original finishes. So I would say all of our houses, none of them are 100% exactly as designed. And in some cases, it's not really our intention to take them back to one particular moment in time to address another person's question from before. Houses evolve. That's part of their history. And if you erase part of that evolution, then you're erasing part of its history.
Any
Good
last
questions.
questions?
Oh, Laura, of course. It's okay.
I don't know if you would want to do this, but in terms of the elms, especially in the auction, I know you were looking to do an oral history with a gentleman who was a teenager at the time and recalled going to the elms for the auction. Is there value in reaching out to the community and trying, or will that just result in a slew of leads that put you down tons of little rabbit holes that you don't want to go down?
I love crowdsourced history. So no, that to me is a great benefit. And it also goes back to this idea of people's perspectives. So someone who's a teenager then versus somebody who may have been a bit more mature, they'll have different perspectives on what they saw. And getting those different perspectives, I think, help us tell a more complete story. If I was a teenager going to the Elms when the auction took place, I don't even know what I would have thought. Art history wasn't a glimmer in my mind at that point. But now in a museum profession, I would probably see it wholeheartedly differently. We do have hundreds of oral histories in our archive. Jenna's actually been digitizing a lot of those, and we're formalizing them more. But that's a program we will do until nobody has memory left. So,
My question also is there may be people in our community who have that stuff sitting in their attics or that grandmother bought and have no idea or think, I wonder if this is something. It's sort of antique roadshow.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, things can be in Aspen, Colorado. They could be in Middletown, Rhode Island. I don't know, unfortunately. And it's learning that and being within that difficult position, trying to reclaim history. We are so dedicated to documenting everything that we do now so that someone 100 years from now can look back and say, okay, we see why they made that decision or why this piece was moved there, et cetera. So, unfortunately with things like written descriptions in a 1962 Park Bernay catalog, that's not always going to register the same way written as it would be visually. But again, I will take anybody's phone call. So, if you think it might be from us, please get in touch.
I think
one more over here. I don't know what time it is. Kate, you have to keep track of that. Sorry.
Given the level of detail to the inside of the house and the collection, can I assume safely to think that just as much attention is given to the landscaping, the history, the conservation of the landscaping, which these buildings were brought to fruition here in Newport for a special reason because of the property?
Absolutely. Well, there's a celebrity in our midst, and his name is Jim Donahue. He's our curator of historical landscapes, and Jim spends a lot of his time researching the history of our landscapes. We've had cultural landscape reports written that document the entire whole horticultural approach to these estate gardens. We're still learning more too. So that's certainly something we don't overlook. In some cases, it will be almost impossible to replicate because the Ulrichs, for example, probably had about 15 dedicated full-time gardeners working on this property. We're not going to have that. So we don't even have 15 people dedicated to 11 properties. But knowing and understanding them is incredibly important. So to answer your question, yes, and I just have to give Jim a plug because he's great at what he does.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. And thank you, Leslie, for helping us lift the curtain on museum work a little bit more. Thank you all, and have a safe travels home. And please check out newportmansions.org for more programming. We hope to see you soon.